From the Institute for Research on Public Policy, this is Demystifying Community Housing, a special series from the Policy Options podcast in collaboration with Community Housing Canada. I'm your host, Ricardo Montrose. Demystifying Community Housing is recorded on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, as well as the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. We also have had the honor of speaking with guests located on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional land of First Nation and Métis people, and also on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. In episode 3 of Demystifying Community Housing, our co-host Hanan Ali and Natasha engage in conversation with three guests. Damian Collins, Professor of Earth and Atmospheric Science at the University of Alberta. He is also the Director of the Community Housing Canada Research Partnership within the Collaborative Housing Research Network. Marika Albert, the Policy Director of B.C. Nonprofit Housing Association, where she leads research and advocacy efforts, and Alex Hemingway, a Senior Economist and Public Finance Policy Analyst at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives B.C. office. Together, they discuss what role community housing can play in addressing the housing crisis, particularly in supporting tenants' well-being as Canada's housing crisis wears on. And I'll leave you with Hanan and Natasha.
Hello, listeners, and welcome back. I'm Natasha, one of your co-hosts.
And I'm your other co-host, Hanan, and today we're here to take you through episode 3 of the podcast. So, how are you feeling, Natasha?
I'm feeling good, and it's great to be back. As you know, we started out this podcast by exploring what community housing means. Then episode 2 builds on this understanding to explore the myriad stories of life told by housing operators and tenants themselves.
Absolutely. The stories we heard in episode 2 offer a springboard to further reflect not only on the distinct mission and mandate of the nonprofit housing sector, but also on its significance as a housing solution to tackle the ongoing housing crisis, a crisis that's largely driven by hyper-commodification and the financialization of housing. In this episode, we had a fantastic opportunity to speak with Damian Collins, Alex Hemingway, and Marika Albert.
The conversations were very informative. As usual, let's first hear from these speakers about themselves.
Well, thank you for the warm welcome. My name is Damian Collins. I'm a professor of human geography at the University of Alberta, which, as you rightly noted, is situated on Treaty 6 territory here in the center of the province of Alberta. I've been working here for a little over 15 years, and my area of specialty is housing and homelessness. And in that capacity, I'm the director of Community Housing Canada, which is a partnership between a group of universities and a group of community housing providers, funded through CMHC and SSHRC, which are federal agencies here in Canada.
Really nice to be here with you. My name's Alex Hemingway. I'm a senior economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives B.C. office, located in Vancouver. And I do research on a range of public policy issues, inequality, taxes, and public finances. But most relevant for us here today is housing policy, which has been a real focus over the past several years.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this podcast. I've really been looking forward to it. So I'm Marika Albert. I'm the Policy Director at the B.C. Nonprofit Housing Association. And I've been with the association for almost 6 years now. And previously to this position, I was the Executive Director of the Community Social Planning Council of Greater Victoria. And the Social Planning Council, the history of social planning councils is that they began during the Great Depression in order to address issues like poverty, of housing affordability, and food security back in the 30s. And so we continued to do that work, looking at poverty reduction and community development initiatives.
To contextualize our conversations with the speakers and the roles of community housing, Hanan, it may be helpful to first unpack the nature and scale of the housing crisis we're facing today.
That's a great point. The housing crisis is a little bit of a buzzword and a fuzzword these days.
Mm-hmm.
Too often, the housing crisis has been reduced to housing unaffordability and housing shortage. According to a recent report by the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, BC alone will need 570,000 new units by 2030 to meet a moderate home purchase affordability level of 44%, the share of disposable income that an average household would need to buy the average home. But the problem with our housing system extends far beyond this. Also, as Ray Sullivan mentions in episode 1, what's important when we talk about this is that we don't simply focus on affordability. We should also ask, housing for whom? Who profits from it? And who is excluded? Unaffordability is only one manifestation of housing vulnerability among many others.
Speaking of this, one way to understand the extent to which the current housing system has failed to meet Canadians' need for housing is the concept of core housing need. It is an indicator used by government agencies to assess how many people face challenges obtaining housing that is affordable, suitable, and adequate. That means they either live in housing that costs more than 30% of their income, that is overcrowded for their household, or is in a poor state of repair and they cannot afford alternative housing in their community. Female-led households, Indigenous households, lone parent households with children, immigrant and refugee-led households are disproportionately more likely to live in core housing need, as are other vulnerable groups.
Other than core housing need, we've also heard about the dreaded renovictions process, where tenants are forced into ending their tenancy so that building owners can renovate their units and eventually rent them at a much higher rent. This is even worse in places where rental vacancy rates are low, or rent controls are loose or non-existent, and where there are financial landlords. Evictions, including renovictions, put low-income tenants at risk of displacement and homelessness. Today, about 25,000 people across Canada are unhoused based on point-in-time counts. This number would be much higher if we were to include hidden homelessness. In other words, people who are provisionally accommodated, such as those who may be couch surfing, staying with friends or family, sleeping in cars, or in abandoned buildings.
So then the housing crisis is a manifestation of all these different housing challenges, right?
Mm-hmm.
It includes the affordability challenge, the financialization of housing, as well as homelessness, tenure insecurity, shortage of accessible units, and the lack of culturally appropriate housing.
Yes, there are serious cracks in Canada's housing system, and these housing challenges offer the most critical intervention point. So the question becomes, how can community housing play a role in alleviating housing stress and insecurity?
Well, the National Housing Strategy recognizes the crucial roles of community housing in addressing these wicked housing problems. And in our conversations with our guests, we discuss what this means from a host of social, economic, and human rights perspectives.
Right, this reminds me of the stories we broadcasted in episode 2 about life in community housing and the impact housing availability and quality has on tenants' lives. These stories demonstrate community housing organizations that exercise a real commitment to tenant health and well-being, although it stretches their mandate in ways that are sometimes uncomfortable or even impossible to maintain. And this attention to community wellness is something that we don't really see within housing policy.
You know, the distinct organizational missions between the nonprofit housing sector and the private market rental sector have been recognized by many. For instance, the Congress of the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association pointed out that, quote, both nonprofit organizations and private housing providers have the opportunity to develop, own, and manage large-scale housing developments for a profit. The key distinction should not be focused on how private and nonprofit housing groups operate, but instead on what profits are used for. Affordable housing operators carry an obligation to reinvest in additional programs for the benefit of tenants. End quote. This is also echoed by our guest, Marika.
So the private sector, their motivation, first and foremost, is profit. So we could have friendly landlords out there. I know some people are kind-hearted, maybe care for their tenants, but ultimately they are looking to make a profit. Nonprofits, on the other hand, are exactly that. Now, if they have access revenues somehow, which is rarely the case, they are mandated to actually reinvest that into their own programs and into their housing that they offer. So, I mean, for me, fundamentally, the motivation is different. And because that motivation is different, community housing can be much more people-centered. It can offer programming in different ways. It can access funding that private sector landlords can't access. And in my mind, in my opinion, they shouldn't access because these are public dollars to support the public.
Continuing our conversation from last episode about how community housing may help support tenant well-being, community wellness, and ensuring a level of financial security for tenants, Marika speaks more about how community housing helps to ensure a stable workforce in the economy.
Community housing sector has had the ability to ensure that we have a well-supported workforce. So even though sometimes we think about workforce housing for more middle-income folks, a lot of people who work minimum wage absolutely benefit from community housing, and directly. And those are folks that we know who are working in the supermarkets, who are working in cleaning up our streets. Many different kinds of jobs don't actually pay well enough for folks to be able to afford market rent. So we do need these positions. We have a division of labor in society, and we absolutely need folks to do things like work a cashier position, those types of things. But really, so being able to provide affordable housing for those families means that they're able to thrive. They're able to not have to make difficult choices about which bills to pay, whether or not they can adequately feed their family, if they can afford the medications they need. So taking off all of those stressors really is, to me, it's the beautiful thing about community housing, and then it ensures that people can actually thrive and participate in their communities without any kind of concern around their income, particularly around rent.
Community housing also plays an important role in building community resilience. For example, during the pandemic, and for those with evolving housing needs, such as aging seniors or tenants in life transitions. I'm
going to talk a little bit about what happened during the pandemic, because I think that really demonstrated how community housing is so special, and how it's able to really support tenants and their well-being. So March 2020, the pandemic hit, we had to shut down. Housing providers during that first period of the shutdown, and actually throughout 2020 and 2021, were really focused on trying to find resources to provide additional supports to their tenants. And what they were finding, and then I'm speaking about more independent social housing, not supportive housing, which is a completely different context, but independent social housing. They were finding that they had tenants who they'd never really heard from before. Folks who were living independently, never reached out for supports, starting to reach out for supports around their mental health, around food security, and around loneliness and isolation. And so some of our members really started working on, like I said, trying to find resources to be able to offer more supports for their tenants. And because they're nonprofit and because they're community housing, they do have access to those types of funding programs. So BC Housing was able to provide funding for meal programs for independent tenants, which we've never seen before. They were able to provide additional funding to set up kind of programs for check-in, to create peer support programs that can happen remotely. We saw volunteer boards, for instance, for smaller societies, calling tenants and checking in on them. So because community housing is people-centered, it really allows us to kind of expand programming in those pieces. So I think supports around food security. So we also see community cupboards pop up in community housing complexes, so people can share food items with each other. We see more programming, social programming happening. So Happy Cities and Hey Neighbor Collaborative have really done a lot of work researching that. And some of our members, like Catalyst Housing, for instance, they offer below market community housing, but they organize tenant picnics, tenant cleanup parties. They actually have a budget line in their budget specifically targeted for tenant activities and supporting tenant engagement. And the larger providers certainly are able to access those resources more easily than the smaller providers. But even our smaller providers that have 10 suites of seniors housing up in northern BC are still able to have that personal face-to-face, that kind of people-centered connection because of their mandate and their mission.
Supportive housing is a form of social housing with more ability to provide resident care and supports. Marika continues to explain the vital role that supportive housing plays in providing support for vulnerable populations.
In supportive housing, this is a programming is part of the housing programs. So there's food, regular food programming. There's access to nurses, healthcare providers. There's access to other types of life skills supports, counseling. So they have what we would call kind of a wraparound service. There are people who need supportive housing, who are struggling to find or are living in market housing that would really benefit from these types of services and supports. And they only really are provided in the community housing system that are accessible for people who are low income or have no income at all. What we've seen is that some of our members who work most exclusively with folks who have been recently homeless or who have multiple complex needs, they have started peer support programs. And in those peer support programs, they kind of build up they do mental health first aid. They do training in overdose response. And so when a peer checks in on you, it's much different. It's a much different power dynamic than it is when the social worker who works in your building checks in on you, right? And so through that, there's some community development that happens. And then we're also building capacity within the tenant population to support each other. And I think that's one way that we've seen some of the supportive housing providers kind of address the challenges of not being able to do wellness checks kind of on a regular basis.
In some cases, housing operators partner with service providers to support their tenants.
So there's an organization called Wholeway House, and I'm not sure if you've heard of them. They operate in the downtown east side, and they do what's called in supports. So they will go and they will support someone living in a senior living in a single residency, an SRO. They'll go and help seniors who are living in independent seniors housing, and they'll take them to appointments. They'll help them with grocery shopping. They'll do some minor health care for them. And we have some of our members, particularly Brightside Community Homes Foundation, continuously signs contracts with them and tries to expand their services. So we've seen some really kind of creative responses to this. And again, trying to kind of get around some of those like policy disconnects around wellness checks and those types of supports that are needed.
Marika highlights the unique social roles that the community housing sector can play to support vulnerabilized groups. In 2019, the National Housing Strategy Act recognized housing as a fundamental human right affirmed in international law. This commits Canada to realizing that right, focusing on people in the greatest housing need. This also makes Canada one of the few countries around the world that include the right to adequate housing in their core legislative frameworks. So, what does this human right mean in the housing policy context? And how can community housing help fulfill this right to housing?
Yeah, these are big policy questions that we'll continue to wrestle with. This recognition of housing as a human right is a milestone, and it commits organizations and governments to design housing policies and programs from a human rights perspective. Damian Collins talks to us about the human right to adequate housing, drawing from international legal instruments that harken back to the post-World War II era.
The story of the human right to housing, or perhaps more accurately, the human right to adequate housing, actually sort of starts outside of Canada. It starts after World War II at the international level with the formation of the United Nations and an increasing recognition in the 1940s and onwards after that point that human rights didn't only encompass traditional freedoms like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. It also encompassed positive rights, rights to society's resources. And those positive claims on society's resources are called economic, social, and cultural rights. And one of the rights that's situated within that is the human right to adequate housing. And it sits alongside other rights, for example, the right to health, the right to water, the right to food, and things like that. So there was this sort of recognition after World War II of the importance of economic, social, and cultural rights, and that they are real rights, they're legitimate. And Canada, of course, was part of that process in the post-war era. Canada agreed to the initial formulation of these rights. And then in 1976, there was a big international legal agreement called the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And that really reaffirmed that everyone, a universal human right exists to have adequate and secure housing. So the story sort of starts at the international level, and then Canada has definitely been a part of that movement towards recognizing these rights, and alongside the great majority of other countries in the world.
The Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, also known as the OHCHR, identified 7 elements for housing to be considered adequate. So this includes security of tenure, availability of basic infrastructure such as safe drinking water and sanitation, affordability, habitability, accessibility, location, and lastly, cultural adequacy. So do these factors define adequacy as we understand it in Canada? Let's turn to how well our current housing policy aligns with enacting this right to housing.
I guess we could start on the legal side of things. That the human right to adequate housing didn't have a lot of legal purchase in Canada until quite recently. It was overlooked, ignored, disregarded, I think it would be fair to say. And that began to change in 2017 with the adoption of the National Housing Strategy. And the National Housing Strategy explicitly recognized the human right to adequate housing. So that was the first time we'd sort of seen at the domestic level in Canada government recognition of a right that existed at the international level, but had never really filtered down to have any purchase on the ground here in Canada. And then in 2019, the federal parliament passed the National Housing Strategy Act, and that act explicitly recognized the human right to housing. It recognized that it has its origins in international law, including the International Covenant that I mentioned earlier. And so at that point, really, the landscape changed quite a lot for discussions around the human right to housing in Canada. It was no longer just a handful of advocates and academics who were talking about it. It really began to get some purchase. It was recognized as a real right. So there was sort of that social acceptance that came with it. And what I've seen since 2019 is that, I guess on the one hand, our housing problems, our housing challenges have probably continued to get worse. But on the other hand, we are really seeing that those housing problems are now being debated and discussed through the lens of the human right to housing. So it has changed the nature of our conversations, the nature of the way we think about the problem, the nature of the way we think about solutions as well. Having said that, it's not a magic bullet, and the problems, if anything, I think most observers would agree, have continued to get worse since 2019.
So, based on Damian's explanation, we see that the legislative landscape and discourse surrounding the right to housing in Canada has evolved over time. But while progress has certainly been made in recognizing this fundamental right, there are still challenges that persist in ensuring its full realization.
Right. This leads us to an essential discussion point. What are the real-life consequences when this fundamental right to adequate housing is not upheld in our communities?
So, one of the components of the right to adequate housing is affordability. And that's probably the aspect that's at the forefront of most people's minds. I think there is widespread agreement in Canada that we have a housing affordability crisis. And I think we have agreement on that point across the political spectrum and across all levels of government, from municipal to federal. And so what we see is a worsening affordability situation, and that's especially true for renters. So the most recent data shows that 1/3 of all renters in Canada are spending more than 30% of their incomes on housing costs, and so that puts them into a situation of unaffordability. And so that calls into question their right to housing under that affordability component. And of course, if you're a renter who's experiencing perhaps rent increases in your existing home, or maybe you've just moved into a new home and you're facing a very high rental cost, the security of that home comes into question. So how long can you really afford to stay there? And so that then brings in a second component of the right to housing, which is security of tenure. So one of the fundamental things about having an adequate home is that you have it for as long as you need it, right? For the medium to long term, that it's available to you, that you can stay there, that it is in fact your home and not just a temporary place of residence, perhaps. And so what we're seeing across Canada is that these components of affordability and tenure security are really being threatened, especially for renters. And we also know that because home prices or house prices are increasing, people are staying renting for longer. And in fact, the proportion of renters is growing in our society. So those would definitely be components of the right to housing that are severely challenged in Canada right now, especially but not exclusively for renters.
In this move towards realizing the right to adequate housing, key elements are increasingly threatened, as Damian tells us. Many individuals face rapidly increasing rental costs while the housing crisis continues to deepen. The Canadian Rental Housing Index revealed a staggering increase in rental costs across the country, with BC and Ontario with the highest proportion of renters spending more than half of their gross income on rent and utilities. According to census data from 2016 to 2021, renter households grew at a faster rate than homeowners because many individuals are essentially being priced out of homeownership.
And another key component of the right to adequate housing highlighted by Damian is tenure security. Loose rent control policies and weak legal protections of tenant rights prevent many tenants from living in secure homes. The legislative recognition of the right to adequate housing marks a significant step forward. But what does this mean for the future of housing policies in Canada?
I think one of the good things that we can say about the adoption of the National Housing Strategy Act and its rights-based approach is that it builds on a lot of work that had been done over the previous decades in terms of defining the right to housing. What does it really mean? What are the rights and the duties that go with it? And so, for example, one of the things that's really built into the human right to housing is this idea of progressive realization. So what that means is that there's a recognition that housing is a complex and expensive area, and you can't really click your fingers and create a universal right to housing overnight in practice. But what you can do is you can commit yourself as a government, as a society, to progressively improving the situation so that more and more people are able to access their right to adequate housing over time. So, unlike, for example, perhaps the right to free speech or the right to vote, which is something that could be implemented very, very quickly, the right to housing is something that requires more of a medium to long-term commitment. And you want to show that you're constantly moving in the right direction, whereby more and more people are able to access the right to housing. And so that idea of progressive realization, which comes from international law, has now been adopted into domestic law in the National Housing Strategy Act. And so it sort of means that governments have to have that forward-looking perspective. Are we constantly moving in the right direction? And one of the ways that we can tell if they're moving in the right direction is how many resources or what level of resourcing is available to achieve this goal. And the international standard is that a society should commit the maximum available resources to realizing the human right to adequate housing. So that's quite a high standard, right? To meet that goal, You have to be putting significant resources into it, and you have to be committed over the medium to long term to improving the situation so that, as I mentioned, an increasing percentage of the population, eventually 100%, we would like, of course, can realize their right to housing.
Damian's discussion on the concept of progressive realization and the allocation of resources towards realizing the right to adequate housing raises critical questions about our housing policies. A recent development in the 2024 federal budget is that the federal government has announced measures to create a home buyer's bill of rights and a renter's bill of rights to ensure transactional transparency and to essentially make the market playing field more fair for households. But how effective these measures are in addressing all the different components of the right to housing remains to be seen, right?
Well, it is at least good to see that tenant rights are considered in federal policy for the first time by deterring bad faith rent evictions and excessive rent increases. But the overall policy approaches to housing remain largely market-driven and center on supply. There are other essential components like location, dwelling accessibility, and protection against discrimination to be considered in order to ensure everyone has access to adequate housing, as Damian explains.
Our conversation around housing is increasingly focused on supply, including the supply of social and affordable units. And in the last year or so in Canada, I think that the argument that the supply is the answer to all our problems has become increasingly strong. And it perhaps dominates the discussion to the exclusion of other questions at certain points. So, I mean, on the one hand, perhaps that's a good problem to have, right? That we have this agreement, we need more supply of housing, including social and affordable rentals. Can't really argue with that. That is certainly part of the equation. But it is important not to lose sight of other components of the right to housing. For example, one of the other components that's been articulated at the international level is location, right? So it's one thing to have an affordable place to live, but what is the neighborhood like? What can you access within your neighborhood? Do you have reasonable access to public transit, to childcare, to healthcare, to educational facilities? So we need to think not only about increasing the supply of housing, but also about where that housing is going to be located. Is it going to be located in neighborhoods that offer, relatively easy, affordable access to all the sorts of places that people need to access in the course of their day or in the course of their week? What protections do people have against unreasonable increases in rents that would threaten their security of tenure? What protections do they have against discrimination, as you mentioned? Well, discrimination in rental housing is already illegal in Canada as a breach of provincial human rights acts. But we know that in practice, it does continue to exist, and that enforcement is relatively weak in terms of addressing discrimination against certain types of people who are looking for rental housing in particular.
Housing policies should take into account the diverse needs and challenges faced by different communities seeking adequate housing. Natasha, as you said earlier, most policy approaches to housing are governed by the market, and they tend to center on supply-side strategies.
Mm-hmm.
So, given the inability of the market to address these problems, then shouldn't we seek solutions that are disconnected from this market mechanism?
Indeed, a human rights approach to the housing crisis requires a housing system that treats housing as a social good rather than an investment commodity.
The need for community housing greatly exceeds the current supply. I was reading a report from the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate, which is a new office created under the National Housing Strategy Act. And they were actually reporting on homeless encampments, which I'm sure we all know are a widespread issue across Canada and seldom far from the news. And it was talking about the issue of homeless encampments through a perspective of rights, and both the rights of people to occupy public space, but also the rights of those people to claim, affordable, safe, secure housing. And one of the interesting things was that the major recommendation for the medium to long term to address homeless encampments was more social and affordable housing. And we actually see that very, very often, that, no matter what the specific issue or the specific challenge we might be looking at is, so often the answer is we need more social and affordable housing, whether it's homeless encampments, whether it's questions of affordability, questions of security of tenure. So often the underlying answer is the same. And so, why is it that so often our policymakers and our researchers advocate for more social and affordable housing? Well, I think there's a recognition that the market is unlikely to supply enough rental housing at sufficiently low cost to address the needs of approximately 1 in 5 households. And, because the market is profit driven, because the market is able to increase rents over time, because those rents might not bear much relationship to what people are actually earning, the solution, as it is more social and affordable housing. It's a logical thing to say, and it's a great aspiration to have, but the magnitude of the issue is huge, right? So how do you take a sector that is currently 4 or 4.5% of the total housing stock? How do you increase that to 10%, 15%, maybe 20%? That is a huge hurdle to overcome. Bringing online that much more supply of social and affordable units, it's not something that can be realized in the short, perhaps not even the medium term. It would require a huge commitment to vastly increasing our stock of social and affordable housing in communities across the country, large and small, to achieve those goals. So on the one hand, it's great that people recognize how valuable community housing is, and that it is, in fact, the solution to many of our problems, especially since we recognize the limited ability of the market to address those problems. But actually putting those recommendations into action at the scale that is needed is extremely difficult.
Damian and Marika have provided valuable insights about the importance of community housing from both social and human rights perspectives. Coming from a public financing background, Alex Hemingway shares similar views.
Well, one thing I wanted to say at the outset is that we need far more non-market housing. We need to increase the share of community housing of the total housing stock. And it's also the case that we need far more housing overall, including market rate housing supply, so we can ease very tight rental markets and bring down rents in the market housing that most people live in. We have an enormous housing shortage overall. So I wanted to set that out as context. But with that in mind, I think building new public and nonprofit housing can play a very important role. It can contribute to easing that overall housing shortage, but it can also create new homes that are immediately more affordable to the folks who move into them and need them. And even in a much better functioning housing market, which we need, we can't count on the market to provide homes that are affordable for everyone. And that's where the real importance of the community housing sector comes in my view. One thing we know is that the share of non-market housing in Canada is much lower than many other developed countries. I've seen different estimates ranging from 3 to 5% of our housing market being non-market housing. And I think at the very least, we should be looking at doubling that share and doing it as quickly as possible. And also doing it in a context, as I referenced earlier, of an expanding overall pie of housing to address that broader housing shortage.
Despite the widespread acknowledgement of the social benefits of non-market housing, a significantly mercantile view of housing as property prevails. Our decision-making processes are still heavily influenced by market logics.
Agreed, Hanan. When it comes to policy making, it's important to turn to the economic aspect of this issue because the financial viability of a project is always central to political decisions. Community housing projects are often considered more costly to build, financially unsustainable, and are likely to distort housing markets or dampen property values. Many of these beliefs merit closer scrutiny.
This is true, unfortunately. As far as the economic aspect is concerned, it's imperative to not only discuss the financial viability of community housing, but also to question whether economic justification alone suffices.
Well, on the viability piece, here's one way to think about the economic viability of non-market or community housing. So think about a location where a private sector rental housing project would be economically viable. So in other words, a situation where the rental income that a project will generate more than offsets the upfront costs of building it. Well, wherever private rental is viable, a public or nonprofit provider is generally going to be viable too. And because a housing project built on a nonprofit basis can be built with break-even rent, so that essentially financed on a break-even basis without a profit margin, it can charge slightly below market rents. Now, that doesn't necessarily get you deeply affordable housing, but it does get you housing that's shielded from the whims of the marketplace and that's desperately needed in a shortage. To achieve deeper housing affordability in the non-market community housing sector, you do need to layer in subsidies of some form or another. Now, I think one piece of context to keep in mind here is that the viability and economics of building new rental housing of all kinds are constantly changing with factors like interest rates, construction costs, land prices, zoning policies, and current market rents. So, in our current context, higher interest rates have become a challenge to financing housing investment, whether it's privately built or whether it's community nonprofit housing. To your latter question about, whether we need an economic justification or not, I think, look, the bottom line is we have a severe housing crisis, enormous housing need, and in my view, there's just a moral imperative to invest in community housing to meet that need, and for governments and for us as a society to fund those efforts to meet our housing needs.
Alex goes further to point out that social and nonprofit housing can be less expensive than many might think. These projects can be financially self-sustaining through break-even rents. In other words, rents are set at a level so that the ongoing rental income can offset project costs, similar to how private sector developers operate. But unlike for-profit developers, community housing can build in a level of affordability by eliminating the developer profit margin. There are also cost advantages associated with public investment in housing.
Building community housing does require a big investment of resources. There's also a certain sense in which it's less expensive than people might think, because building housing isn't just a cost. It also generates an ongoing stream of rental income, which can help cover the upfront investment costs. That's, as we discussed, that's the business model for private sector housing developers. You cover your financing costs and profit margin with the rents. And if you're a public or not-for-profit housing developer, you can essentially do the same thing now and cover your costs with the rents. In a high interest rate and high construction cost environment, those break-even rents you're going to charge as a nonprofit provider are still likely to be fairly high, but at least a significant portion of the investment is self-financing. And then to get more affordability built in, that's where you need to begin layering in those subsidies where public sector funding is needed, those grants, those operating subsidies, and also assistance from the public sector in the form of low interest loans, which can also help keep those financing costs down in the difficult interest rate environment we're in. So two main cost advantages that are specific to public investment in housing are, one, you can cut out the private developer profit margin. And so that can, that's often in the case of rental housing thought to be on the order of 10 to 15% of project costs. So there's savings that can be realized there. And if you're the government, your borrowing costs are lower than the private sector, and there's savings that can be realized through those lower borrowing costs.
So the break-even rents for a community housing project can be around 15% below the market rate, or even lower if the borrowing costs are lower. This is great, but such break-even rents may still be out of reach for many. Considering the context where land values are appreciating and construction costs, including labor costs, are on the rise, I wonder how nonprofit housing projects can achieve better affordability.
Mm-hmm. According to Alex, bringing down the costs of land, construction, operation, and financing through policy measures are essential to achieving a deeper level of affordability for community housing.
Yeah, there's no way around it. If we want to build more deeply affordable community, nonprofit, and public housing units in this environment, that requires funding and subsidies. It requires upfront capital grants to help with the viability of those projects, and in ongoing subsidies, especially for the lowest income residents. Land contributions from the public sector can also help bring down those costs. But of course, once you use that land for one project, it's not available for the next one. So I don't think I like to avoid thinking of those land contributions as free, because we need to replenish the supply of public land to keep building these types of projects. Now, there are other ways to reduce costs for non-market and market housing developments that can be very important as well, including reducing parking requirements, which are hugely expensive. I think some folks may not realize that building one underground parking space can cost upwards of $50,000, and so when you have hundreds of parking spaces, that significantly drives up the cost of projects. Another way to reduce cost is using standardized housing designs. And that's something that the province here in BC is pursuing right now, bringing forward those types of designs that municipalities could adopt and allow to be built quickly. And going back to something we touched on earlier, speeding up municipal approvals processes can actually bring down the costs for non-market housing as well.
Let's backtrack here a little, Natasha. Alex sheds light on key avenues for community housing to achieve better affordability than market rentals. These include cutting out private developer profit margins and leveraging lower borrowing costs, and other cost savings that could be realized through land and zoning related policies.
Yeah, Alex's comments defy the widely held belief that all community housing requires ongoing subsidies. Some nonprofit organizations in our show also said that they keep deeply affordable units through a cross-subsidy within a building or a series of buildings. This is unheard of for-profit developers or landlords.
Exactly. There are several ways to achieve housing affordability while maintaining financial sustainability for community housing projects. Key to this, however, is scale. As many of our guests pointed out, the public funding and financing to date have mostly tailored to homeowners and private landlords and developers, while community housing is significantly underfunded. If we can expand the community housing sector, the economies of scale would further lower the costs of these projects.
Speaking of the scale, the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association recently published a thorough study on the impact of community housing on economic productivity. They confirmed a strong and positive relationship between the scale of community housing stock and the national economy. They projected that increasing the proportion of this sector in Canada by 1.5 percentage points would boost GDP by $67 to $136 billion.
This is a significant and tangible impact to the economy. It also confirms Marika's earlier points regarding the stabilizing effects of the community housing sector on our workforce. But if public investments in the sector are substantially increased, what would it mean for government finances and debts? Alex's answer to this is surprisingly little.
To achieve more deeply affordable rents, you do need ongoing subsidies, land contributions, and capital grants. But as we've also discussed, if you're a government building non-market housing, that's structured to operate on a break-even basis, even though that probably means you're charging fairly high rents, not much below market, that's a form of self-financing. So, and that's a big chunk of the cost of a project is those capital costs that you can finance on a break-even basis through the rents. So the related debt that's taken on to make that type of investment can be considered self-supported debt as opposed to taxpayer-supported debt. And that reduces the effect on government finances. And that distinction between self-supported and taxpayer-supported debt is one that the credit rating agencies that look at public debt levels are attentive to. So if this type of effort to scale up public investment funding with self-supported debt projects, if it's done credibly, if it's done at arm's length with a Crown corporation that's charged with constructing and operating these projects on that self-sustaining basis, that can actually help open up more room for capital investment and borrowing that's necessary to scale up that public investment in housing. And that's something the credit rating agencies pay attention to. So from there, once you have a portfolio of projects that are operating on that break-even basis, you can decide how much you want and need to bring down the rents in these projects and use separate subsidy streams to do so. Subsidies that are funded out of tax revenues, but are hived off for accounting purposes from that core self-financing component of these projects.
So what Alex is saying is that investing in public housing need not affect the annual provincial budget balance or redirect tax dollars from other public policy priorities.
Exactly. It's also important to note that once the upfront costs of new housing are paid off, the buildings and the land remain valuable assets for the public sector to achieve long-term affordability. This discussion here presents a promising approach for expanding public investment in community housing at a scale that could fundamentally change Canada's housing system. Natasha, we've had fruitful conversations with Damian, Alex, and Marika about the unique roles that community housing can play in alleviating housing vulnerabilities. If we are to leverage community housing as a possible solution to the housing crisis, how should we go about mitigating these challenges to preserve the existing social housing stock and grow the sector further?
Right, Hanan, they are crucial challenges, and the insights provided by our guest speakers in this discussion spawn additional questions. How does the community housing sector operate within the current policy context with diminished resources and power? What are key challenges for community housing operators in providing, maintaining, and sustaining affordable, stable, and decent housing? Importantly, how do they overcome these challenges, and how should public policies support the sustainability and resilience of this sector?
These are questions we will set out to explore in episode 4. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in today. Stay tuned for our next discussion, where we engage with experts and practitioners to talk about business practices and exploring innovative ways to become more self-sustaining, while continuing to support tenant well-being and community resilience.
Thank you for tuning into Demystifying Community Housing, a special series from the Policy Options podcast. The production of this podcast series is led by Yushu Ju and Meg Olden at Simon Fraser University as part of the Community Housing Canada project and collaboration with the IRPP. This episode has been a dedicated collaboration with production assistance by Ricardo Montrose and Luc Moulinson and audio by Jackie Garnett. If you like what you heard and would like to know more about the Institute for Research on Public Policy, head over to irpp.org. We'll be back soon with more episodes. This was Ricardo Montrose. Thank you for listening.